A black sedan screeched to a halt, and a messenger shoved a sealed envelope into Isabella Rossi's hands as masked shapes filled the alley mouth. Fear tightened in her throat. She stepped back, the envelope damp where his fingers had pressed the seal. And the men left with 3 slow, deliberate kicks against a puddle that sent water toward her shoes. Isabella felt fear first, and then the mechanical sorting of decisions. Move, hide, warn. Sophia refused to be dragged into anything. She folded the envelope once with deliberate fingers and ran toward the trattoria light, nails beating the cobblestones as she crossed the narrow street. Inside Sophia's trattoria, the bell clattered against the door and oil smoke and warm bread wrapped the room. Isabella shoved the envelope onto the counter with both hands so Sophia could not miss the seal. Fear, which had been a cold pressure in her ribs since the sedan, pulled at the back of her voice. She kept her words short so the trimmer would not carry Sophia, Isabella, and the name landed like a plea. Sophia took the envelope with a single motion and folded her hands over it as if closing a small animal. Give me that, Sophia, and her voice steadied the room. Sophia smelled of espresso and lemon peel and moved with the steady efficiency of someone who had learned to fix things by hand. Isabella, who gave this to you? A man from a car masked. They left it, and they left the look. Isabella's hands opened, showing the antique locket beneath her palm where it looped from her neck. They want me to know they found me. Sophia turned the paper over under the low light. The envelope bore no name, only a single black stamp that made the letters of Rossi seem smaller than ever. Sophia's jaw tightened. This is not a prank, Sophia, Enzo smirked. He doesn't send paper unless he wants you to be watched. She set the envelope down and moved behind the counter to ring the back door bell 3 short times. The bell had a dry, flat chime. It meant staff only. Marco will not like this. Isabella's first shift of feeling arrived then. Suspicion. She had avoided both names for years. The Rossi name had been a set of closed doors for her, not a badge to carry. She had made a life of late shifts at the bookstore, borrowed jackets, and long walks away from the main squares. Suspicion that someone had tracked her routine tightened her shoulders. She glared at Sophia. I told you I'm fine. I left it all. I want to be dragged back. Sophia's hands flattened on the counter. Isabella, you know how Enzo works. He wants a spectacle. He wants to show he can take what Rossi keeps close. He will try to drag you into the open. The words pushed Isabella into a different posture. The second emotion shift arrived, defiant refusal turning toward resigned care. She squeezed the locket between thumb and finger until the metal warmed. I want to let him use me to start a war, she said. An external sound cut that argument. Heavy shoes on the front steps. The trattoria's front door opened, and a man who moved like he owned the block stepped inside. Marco Santoro filled the doorway in a tailored overcoat, black hair slicked back, and a signet ring catching the amber lamp. He did not need an introduction. His arrival pulled attention like a hand on a tight curtain. Marco, Sophia, voice sharper than before. Marco nodded once at Sophia and twice at Isabella, his eyes steady, not warm but not cold to her. He smelled of cedar and smoke, a controlled scent that made Isabella take a breath without planning to. He did not speak right away. He had a way of looking at a room and cataloguing exits, people, and the smallest balances of power. He lifted one hand and tilted the envelope toward the light. His fingers steepled together for a moment. Let me see it, Marco. Sophia handed the paper over. He unfolded it with the efficiency of someone who had learned which folds mattered. Inside, a single line of handwriting. Bring her to the square at midnight or you will learn the cost. Marco's jaw moved. Enzo is putting a public clock on this. He wants an audience. He set the paper on the counter with slow fingers. Isabella, you cannot stay where you are when he names a time and place. Isabella pulled back as if the words pushed her. I can leave like a hostage and let them claim me. I am not a Rossi tool, Isabella. Marco more softly, and that word was a command wrapped in a choice. This is not about tools. Enzo wants to humiliate the Rossi hold. He will take you in the street. He will take you in front of people you know. If you stay, you put Sofia at risk. You put the trattoria at risk. Sofia stepped forward. Isabella, please. Let us find somewhere safer tonight. Just for a few hours. Isabella's hands moved to the satchel at her side as if to collect a life instead of a bag. She thought of her rented room upstairs, of stacks of unpaid bills in a small box, of the borrowed books with shelf marks. She thought of the scar on her eyebrow, the locket her mother had given her that did not open easily. The second shift, defiance giving way, hardened into a decision that still felt like theft from herself. "All right," she said. "One night. But I do not belong to any of you." Marco did not smile. He offered only a nod that said he had heard the terms. Outside, rain began in a fine sheet, the asphalt brightening under street lamps. That rain would matter soon. An outside event arrived as Marco's men exchanged a brief look and left through the back to secure exits. The trattoria's back room doors closed for staff only. The small back room smelled of tomato sauce and old wood. It held a service entrance and a narrow staircase to the apartment above. Marco had 2 men stationed by the kitchen window within 5 minutes. They moved with quiet precision. Marco's voice in the room was low. "We will not march you anywhere, Isabella. We will put a guard and move you when it is safe." He kept his hands visible, a detail that made Sofia nod once with relief. They sat at the small table by the window. Sofia poured tea into chipped cups as though this were any other night of closing. The tea steam cut the sting of cold hands, and for a brief moment, offered a small normality. Conversation tightened and unraveled around simple tasks: a spoon, a napkin, a window cracked to listen. Then Marco, a senior man, returned with a captive dragged across his shoulders like a sack. He threw the man into the back room with little ceremony. The captive's voice was muffled and quick. "Enzo sent us to watch the Rossi girl." The man started, then broke under the kitchen lights. Marco leaned forward. "You will speak one name now. Say Enzo, and say what he plans." The man curled his hands. He smelled of cheap cologne and fear. "Enzo will take her publicly. Midnight at the Vittoria Square. Make it painful. Make the Rossi family answer." Isabella's breath halted. A mid-chapter cliffhanger jolted the room into stillness. The plan was public, timed, and meant to force a reaction. That revelation made the floor under Isabella's choices feel like a moving thing. Sofia's eyes cut to Isabella. "Midnight," she said, short question stacking like plates. "Yes," the man choked. "He'd tear down the Rossi pride in front of the church." Isabella pushed back her chair hard enough that it scraped. "I won TB bait," she said. Her voice grew stripped of argument and filled with a tighter, brittle resolve. This was not a poetic shift. It was a change in posture. She moved to the window and peered at the street, where puddles flashed the street lamp like small coins. Marco stood and stepped toward her with a careful reach that did not touch. "You won TB bait, Isabella. You will not walk into a show. Let me move you." "Move me where?" "Isabella, to a house where I am watched like an animal." Her chest tightened. She did not want to be in anyone's custody. "We will take you somewhere you can live your life while we answer Enzo on our terms," Marco replied. Isabella looked at Sofia and then at Marco. She thought of her mother's handwriting on a small torn recipe card kept in the locket. She thought of the books in the shop that smelled like dust and glue. The emotion shift here was sharp. Fear layered into anger, which hardened into a practical decision. "No public theater. Isabella, if you move me, I want one condition. I keep my routine. I keep what I choose. I don't become a symbol at your parties." Marco's eyes tightened. "You keep what you can keep, Isabella. You will not be paraded." His tone made the promise feel like an ordered shield. After that, the line outside the door thudded with boots. Enzo's men crashed through the back door in a controlled rush, the kitchen splintering as a wooden crate flew across the room. Plates clattered. A man fell against the oven with a metallic cry. Sofia pushed a frying pan instinctively. "Get down!" Marco snapped. His voice filled the small room the way a bell fills a chapel. He moved in front of Isabella and Sofia without hesitation and raised his hands. Marco's men met the attack with sets of quiet, efficient blows and the sound of bodies hitting tile. The kitchen filled with the choking smell of smoke from a knocked-over pan. A single moment, one of violent collision, became the peak. Marco's movement placed him between attackers and the two women. His body closed that line. Isabella stood, frozen for a heartbeat, watching Marco take another man's arm and wrench it behind his back. Her hands clenched on the satchel strap until the leather pinched into her palm. She remembered the sound of the rain outside, the way the wet cobbles hid footprints. She felt purely physical fear. Hands that shook, lungs that burned from the quick movement. After the attackers were subdued and the back door lay in splinters, Marco moved one step closer to Isabella, then farther away, keeping the space between them precise. He nothing but gave the room a command. "We leave now," Marco ordered. Isabella's legs answered like someone pulled a rope. She let Marco guide her to the back door. The city air hit them in a wave of cool rain. Marco's car waited on the side street, glossy and dark, a closed capsule of warm leather and safety. He carried Isabella up the shallow steps and eased her into the passenger seat. Inside the car, the world compressed. The leather smelled like cedar and rain. Isabella folded and refolded the envelope in her lap until its edges relaxed. Marco sat, his hands flat on his knees. He did not reach for her. He kept a polite, guarded distance that felt like armor. "You should not have been alone tonight, Marco." "I chose alone," Isabella replied. "I chose the bookstore and small hours. I chose not to be part of this." Marco's hand found the locket on her chain, as if drawn by habit. He did not open it, but rested a palm over the antique gold. "Choices have consequences," he said. "You have obligations you refuse to name." Isabella looked out the car window at the Trattoria's S sign shrinking behind them. The lights on the wet street pulled at her like the threads of a fabric being taken away. She felt a final wave of something that was not fear exactly, but a steadier, tighter resolve. She would not be used as a provocation. But she also would not voluntarily step into a war. The car drove toward a safe house they had chosen. A modest flat above a locksmith's on a quiet lane, not a Rossi mansion, not a fortress, because Isabella had demanded something close to ordinary. They arrived with the sky still holding the last of the rain. Marco's men moved with practiced silence as they checked doors and draped thin blackout curtains. Inside, Sofia folded a blanket and placed it on the small couch. She moved with hands that trembled in small places but steadied when she folded cloth. Isabella sat and unlatched the locket. She pressed the tiny hinge until it gave and found a sliver of a faded photograph inside. Two women at a market stall, a child's braid across one shoulder, concrete memory pressed up. A mother with flour on her hands, a wooden spoon leaned against a jar, a laugh broken by cough but steady. The memory was not described as fragments. It was a set of exact things that brought a tear to Isabella's eye. She breathed, and the next emotion shift moved her from shocked and fearful to a protective clarity. She set the locket back on the table with a slow hand. Marco watched her with a guarded look. "We will answer Enzo," he said, "but not tonight. We will plan." Isabella nodded. "Plan how?" she asked. Marco named targets, not with boasting but practical measures, intercepts, quiet watch shifts, and a promise to hold Enzo to his threat on their terms. His speech was small and tactical. The night edged toward dawn. In a quiet rooftop pause above the flat, Isabella stood with the locket against her palm as the city lightened in a wash of colors from sodium orange to pale gray. The conversation had slowed into a pattern of small tasks. Men checking locks, Sofia brewing coffee, Marco making a phone call that ended in a soft, clipped promise. They had resolved the immediate scuffle and the immediate danger. The chapter's conflict closed with concrete movement, escape, shelter, plan. Isabella did not make a speech. She tied the locket back against her collar and took a step that closed a small gap. She lifted her chin as if measuring the street below, and then put on the coat she had worn when the sedan stopped her. The final paragraph must end on a concrete beat rather than a general statement, and here that beat arrives. A car door thumped open on the street below, and Marco's voice said her name as he offered the hand she would take to leave for a night that was meant to keep her safe, but would not erase the fact that Enzo had set a clock. "Isabella," he said, and his single word opened the next decision. As Isabella slid the iron shutter down, two men shoved a sealed photograph and a single black glove through the bookshop's mail slot and walked away. Fear tightened her stomach before her hands could finish locking the latch. She pressed her palm to the photograph and felt its damp corner where a thumb had left a print. She recognized the dark sleeve in the image and the alley shown on the back, an alley she had promised herself she would never use again. The central problem stood clear inside the shop. Someone wanted to drag her back into Rossi trouble, and they had found a place she thought private. Isabella swallowed. Her fingers shook, and she folded the photograph into her coat pocket without looking at Sophia's note pinned under the counter light. She took the item straight to Sophia's trattoria. The bell over the door jingled twice. Sophia looked up from kneading dough, wiped her hands on a stained apron, and met Isabella at the back room table. Isabella put the photograph and glove on the scarred wood. Sophia touched the glove, lifted the photograph, then said, "Isabella, who would send this?" Isabella answered by handing over the locket and tapping its tiny clasp. She had worn that locket since childhood. It contained the ledger scrap she'd never shown anyone, someone who knows where the ledger was hidden. Isabella. And her voice was steady but low. The word fear had been a live thing in her chest since the mail slot. Sophia leaned close until the light struck her face. "That picture is old. That's the Rossi store alley by the warehouse," she said. "Enzo's men know that alley. They know you know it." Isabella's doubt broke into something raw. She had spent 5 years building a quiet life above the trattoria. The shop window, the stacks of second-hand poetry, the slow afternoons, those were the facts of her survival. Now those facts were under threat. They used to force me to hide ledgers there. I put something away once. If Enzo thinks it's still there, he'll come after it. Her jaw tightened and her hands stopped along the table edge. Sophia tapped the photograph with 2 fingers. "Enzo will make this noisy if he must. He likes messages." The sentence landed like a coin on tile. Sophia had known the family's danger in practical terms for years. She did not dramatize. She set out 2 cups of tea and said, "We call Marco." Isabella closed her eyes for a beat. The name alone rearranged air. Marco Santoro was a problem she had refused for a long time. He was the controlled hand at the edge of every Rossi fight. Accepting his involvement meant accepting the family orbit again. They stepped into the street together, where a glossy black car idled beneath a lamppost. Marco emerged from the shadow between the vehicle and the building like he belonged to the night itself. Isabella felt a second emotion shift. Suspicion leaned into fear and then hardened into brittle anger. Marco's voice was low when he said, "Isabella." He did not smile. He set a small, precise hand on the table's corner inside the trattoria. "I was told you received something tonight." Sophia answered before Isabella could. "A photograph, Marco." "A glove." "They sent it through the slot." "They know the alley." Marco's eyes narrowed. He steepled his fingers for a long second, and then said, "You should not have been alone tonight." The sentence carried neither apology nor accusation. It carried an order. Isabella's chest went tight. "I lock up every night, Marco. I keep the shutters down. I keep the books inside. Why would this change now?" Marco's hand moved once, a controlled reach that brushed the back of a chair as if steadying himself. "Because they are testing boundaries," he said. "Enzo will push until you answer. He will test whether the Rossi will step back or step in." Sophia put one hand on Isabella's arm. "Isabella, you told me you hid something once. Where did you put it?" Isabella almost laughed at the way danger demanded inventory. under the floorboard near the register. I thought no one would look there anymore. She saw Marco's expression flicker when she said register. The ledger scrap inside her locket had been a folded column of numbers and names. It linked a Rossi shipment to a payment. She had intended to keep it buried. They left in Marco's car. The street smelled faintly of lemon oil and frying garlic. The vehicle's interior was warm. Marco drove without haste. He did not ask to be told everything. He listened and tilted his head on the turns. Isabella answered questions in short sentences. She Marco about the previous night with the black sedan. A messenger shoved an envelope into my hands, and the men left with 3 kicks at a puddle outside. Marco's jaw tightened at the memory spoken aloud, and a new emotion arrived in Isabella. A cold calculation. Suspicion, fear, and calculation moved through her in quick succession. She began to watch for patterns she had ignored before. At dawn the next morning, a neighbor screamed. Isabella ran to the shop and found the front window smashed. A single bloodied handkerchief lay on the counter where customers once ran fingers across old editions. A stranger from the bakery was already calling out, "Isabella, are you?" Sophia arrived and crouched beside the counter, hands trembling. The neighborhood shifted toward them in whispers. The public escalation had arrived. The smashed glass made privacy impossible. Someone had wanted everyone to see that the Rossi hold could be punctured. Isabella felt heat in her face and an unexpected surge of anger. She packed the broken glass into a box with gloved hands and placed the box in the storeroom. She found the handkerchief and opened it. Inside, tucked beneath blood, stiffened cloth, was a scrap of paper with a name and a number of money. This time the scrap referenced a specific transaction, one that matched the partial account in her locket. The ledger piece and the handkerchief linked the Rossi to an old payment. That connection shifted the danger. It made the threat more than intimidation. It made it evidence. Sophia read the note aloud, a payment to Lucari. October, 7 years ago. Isabella looked at the dates and then at Sophia. I remember now. My brother took money to settle something, and I thought it was covered. The recall felt physical. Her throat closed, and she swallowed 3 times. Marco arrived as the bakery backed away from the window. He set one palm on the counter and said, "Enzo wants leverage. If he can show a Rossi hand in that payment, he can turn allies away." He spoke plainly. "Isabella, stay with me tonight. Let us sort what is safe and what is not." Isabella's first instinct was to push away. Her independence was the life she had built. But when she lifted the locket from her blouse and saw the ledger scrap inside, the numbers seemed less like proof and more like a burden she had carried unknowingly. They searched the locket again beneath the sofa in Isabella's flat. The floorboard by the register was gone now in the shop. She remembered digging a small hollow and tucking the paper there years ago. Instead of the ledger scrap she expected, she found a second photograph. A younger Enzo Lucari shaking hands with a Rossi cousin Isabella had not seen in a decade. The new photograph changed the interpretation. The twist hit them all. The payment did not prove criminal embezzlement. It captured a meeting where both sides arranged a settlement. If Enzo had the photograph and the ledger scrap, he could show the arrangement and claim the Rossi benefited unfairly. He could also paint the Rossi as traitors or thieves depending on which frame he chose to show. Isabella's fear altered into a precise, cold anger. She set her hands on the kitchen table and said, "He isn't just threatening me. He is trying to rewrite who the Rossi are in public." Sophia slammed a mug down and said, "Then we stop him from rewriting anything." Marco did not answer in words at first. He moved through the flat with controlled steps, checking doors, the stairwell, the locks. He small, sharp questions, and every time Isabella answered, she heard more of herself returning to the role she had left. The second emotion shift completed. Fear to anger to planning. That evening the trattoria filled with customers and the normal clatter of plates. The mood had not forgotten the smashed window, but Sophia kept moving. Isabella sat near the back, watching the door. Around midnight, 3 men in plain jackets pushed through the swinging doors and moved straight to the bar. Their eyes scanned the room like they were checking a list. Sophia's smile stayed on her face, but she shifted closer to Isabella. One of the men did not even speak. He tapped his cigarette ash 2 times in a deliberate rhythm, and then leaned to place his palm on the table between them. He slid a small envelope across the wood. Isabella looked at the envelope. Inside was a single line. Bring what you have to the warehouse at midnight, or Sophia pays for your silence. The words acted like an external event designed to force action. Marco's hand closed on the table. He stood, and his movement made a very small arc of shadow across the plates. We do not meet them. We set a counter. The 3 men laughed softly. 1. You will be alone soon, Santoro. A short, sharp exchange followed between Marco and the man. Marco, leave now, man. You want a show. Marco, no, I want them gone. Now, Sophia interjected. Enzo's men, get out of here. The Bass regulars took in the confrontation and then looked away. The rapid back and forth had 3 complete exchanges and then silence. The men left. Their steps clacked on tile. Outside, the street held its breath. Marco Isabella to lock the back door and to meet him at the warehouse in an hour. He would not run an ambush. He arranged a plan that felt more like a controlled extraction than a trap. Isabella agreed because she had nowhere else to go. The decision was small and operational, but it mattered. Choosing to go to the warehouse placed her back into Rossi geography. At the warehouse the lights were bare bulbs humming above crates. A damp smell rose from the concrete. Isabella kept her hands visible as she walked between rows of stacked boxes. Men shifted in the shadows. Then the ambush began. Enzo's men pushed Sophia from the far end of the crates and seized her by the shoulders. Sophia's cry sliced the air. Sophia! Isabella stepped forward and reached, but a hand closed over her wrist and twisted a way that made her breath leave her lungs. Marco moved like a door being thrown open. He struck twice, not to kill but to disable. The sounds were quick. Fists, a yelp, a chair kicked over. The camera of the mind would show fast violence. The reality was close, loud, and full of grit. Inside the struggle a rapid exchange of lines took place. Enzo's lieutenant sneered. You thought you could hide, Isabella, Marco barked. Let her go, Lieutenant. You will pay for this, Santoro. Marco. Not tonight. The back and forth lasted 5 beats before Marco pulled Sophia behind his shoulder and they sprinted to the exit. In the alley, Isabella tasted metal from a bite to her lip. Sophia's sleeve was torn. Marco kept moving until he reached the car, then shoved Sophia inside. He looked at Isabella and said, Get in. The men outside shouted orders. Someone fired a shot that ricocheted off a metal dumpster, making a staccato echo. The ambush had become a rescue in a matter of seconds. They drove without the smooth control Marco normally kept. Sophia sobbed into a folded napkin. Isabella's hands bled where a nail had scraped her palm during the scuffle. The 3 sat in the warm car and listened to tires on wet pavement. No one spoke for a long, raw minute. Then Sophia, you saved me. Thank you, Marco. Marco's reply was minimal. We leave tonight. Isabella, you will accept guarded relocation. It is not forever. It is for safety while we trace Lucari's move. Isabella felt old resistance flare. I won TB boxed into their world, Marco. I promised myself I would not return. Marco's face remained controlled. Staying alone is not a promise of safety anymore. This is not about pride. It is about who survives. The choice arrived as concrete action to be taken, not as an abstract value. Isabella thought of the ledger scrap and the photograph, of the smashed window and the bloodied handkerchief. She thought of Sophia's hands and the way Marco had moved. Her independence felt suddenly fragile beside Sophia's whole life and the neighbors' faces peering out their windows. She stood on the sidewalk in the damp air while the car idled. The final emotion shift moved from anger into a reluctant acceptance. Isabella set the locket between her fingers and then closed her fist around it. All right, I'll come with you. But this is temporary. I keep the locket on me. I keep my keys. I keep my books. Marco nodded once. Sophia reached for Isabella's hand and squeezed it hard. They did not go to a safe house that night. Marco drove to the rooftop above the old Italian district, where the city opened quietly into the warm, amber skyline. The dawn would be hours away, but the horizon already carried a faint, reddened edge. Isabella climbed the low parapet with the locket pressed to her breast and watched the street where the window had been smashed. She felt the weight of choice in her thighs. The rooftop felt like a place to count losses and name next moves. Marco stood a few paces away. He did not come closer until she had put the locket back under her shirt. "Tonight you let me shield you," he said. "Tomorrow we find who handed the photograph to Enzo, and we decide what to reveal to the neighborhood." Isabella turned to him and said, "We will do it together." "But I will not be controlled." Marco cocked his head and said, "Then we work within your rules as much as we can. But you will not be alone in this." She held the locket and felt its enamel cool against her palm. Below, the Trattoria's neon sign was a small pulse. The city smelled of lemon oil and coffee and rain, damp stone. The chapter's immediate conflict had resolved. Sophia was free, the public warning had been answered, and Isabella had accepted temporary protection. The ledger scrap's presence meant the larger fight was not over. They had a new piece of proof, a photo that reframed a past settlement, and a group of men who would not stop pushing. Isabella stepped away from the parapet and pulled her coat tighter. The concrete choice lay clearly before her. Accept help and trade some privacy for safety, or stay alone and risk everything on a hope that the threats would stop. She slid into the car when Marco opened the rear door for her, and the vehicle rolled away toward a new, guarded morning. Every decision from here would be recorded in small acts: what door she used, who she trusted, which ledger pages they chose to show. Tonight one secret had become evidence and forced a choice. The rooftop light went with them as the car turned a corner and the Trattoria sign dimmed behind them. The next move would belong to the men who had sent the photograph, and Isabella would be there to meet it, not as someone hiding, but as someone who had chosen how to fight. A black sedan slammed the brakes, and a shot punched the lamp above the Trattoria before Isabella could take 2 steps. Fear tightened her throat. She lost the breath she had been saving for a quiet reply to Sophia's question and stumbled, hands scrabbling for the cobbles. A vendor's crate toppled and tomatoes cracked under boots. A sealed envelope spun across the wet street and struck Isabella's calf. She bent to pick it up and found her fingers slick where a thumb had pressed the seal. The concrete stake was clear. Someone was hunting her, and the fear pushed her toward a choice she had resisted for months. Isabella kept the envelope clutched as men in dark coats swept the alley. She saw a man step back into the shadows and recognized the broad shoulders from the photograph that had arrived weeks earlier. The same silhouette that had watched the bookshop door. Doubt had hovered over her for days. Now fear drove her feet. She shoved her satchel higher on her shoulder and moved towards Sophia's open door, forcing her hands to work because thinking made her limbs go cold. Inside the Trattoria kitchen, Sophia set down a steaming pot and reached for Isabella's trembling hands. "Isabella, what happened?" "Sophia." Her voice was a steady anchor, small, loud enough to cut through the clatter. Sophia's fingers probed for cuts and counted the tremor in Isabella's grip. Isabella pressed the sealed envelope to the table and let the smell of lemon oil and old paper anchor her for a second. Sophia's reply was immediate. "We call Marco." Sophia held Isabella's wrist. "You can do this alone." Her insistence carried the weight of the neighborhood. Sophia moved with purpose, wrapping a towel around Isabella's hand where small gravel had scraped the skin. Isabella pulled away from the towel and whispered, "No." Not yet. Her voice was low but steady. She looked at the shuttered shop across the street where the photograph had arrived. The photograph and the glove had made her stomach knot in the earlier week. The memory of that black glove entering the mail slot lived in the same place as the envelope now. Her resistance came from the life she had built, books, small rituals, a till that balanced at close, and from the rule she had set for herself. Do not let Rossi protections take over her days. That rule broke when a tailored car rolled up and two men in grey coats stepped out, followed by Marco Santoro. He moved like someone who owned the street without claiming it. His coat hung immaculate despite the rain. Marco's presence pushed the kitchen air into a narrower shape. Isabella had seen him before, on the curb at funerals, at windows watching negotiations, but tonight he moved toward her with a deliberate speed. Marco's hand found the envelope on the counter. He opened it carefully and drew out a scrap of paper and a small square of cloth with a faint cologne stain. He did not look up when he said, "This ties the attack to someone who reads your ledger at the shop." His voice was low and even. Isabella's fingers tightened on the locket under her collar. Her face had the same reserved set as always, but inside she recalculated who could be trusted. Sophia stepped between them. "You can take her. Sophia, she runs the bookshop." "She isn't tea. Sophia," Marco cut, and his look held the room still. "I'm not taking her for the name. I am taking her because she was almost left on the street tonight." He ate slowly, as if each word were a measured decision. Marco glanced at Isabella, and for a moment something like concern moved across his face, then tightened into custody. Isabella met his eyes. Her refusal and the fear in her chest sparked the second emotional shift. Doubt shifted into reluctant acceptance. "Isabella, I keep the shop open. People depend on me. People will depend on you less if someone shoots you at closing," Marco replied. He reached out and guided her with a controlled motion that never felt rough. Isabella let the hand stay on the small of her back, testing the boundary between protection and control. She saw Sophia watching, the apron tied tight, voice quivering though her posture did not. Back in the warm kitchen, Sophia pressed tea into Isabella's hands and lowered her voice. "Listen to me, Bella. Hide for a night. Let Marco arrange it. We can pack the safe box, hide the ledger." Sophia's sentences came quick, practical. Isabella shook her head. "No, I will not be moved into a house I can leave. I will not vanish." Her sentence was firm. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked at Sophia, then at the door where the rain made puddles in the light. Sophia leaned in close. "You fled that life for a reason, Bella. Remember the mornings you counted inventory by hand. Remember the customer who needed a book and cried in your easel." Sophia's voice slowed, relying on concrete memory to anchor Isabella's choice. Her hands found Isabella's. "We built this for you." Dante handed it away. The pleer pulled at Isabella's stubbornness, and a second emotion shift took place. Resistance to surrender turned into protective resolve toward her shop. The room tightened with a sound from the street, an entrance into the trattoria hallway as Marco returned with two of his aides. He placed the locket on the counter and set it open so Isabella could see the age of the photograph inside. He pressed the scrap of fabric closer where the cologne stain sat like a fingerprint. "This smells like Enzo's brand, Marco. This receipt, though. Someone who visits the shop weekly used this calf. Someone close." He did not say names. He let the implication hang. Isabella's fingers brushed the locket and found a fresh smudge. The recognition came like a punch. Betrayal moved through her in a concrete way. She felt the locket slip and almost fall. Her heart thudded between ribs, as if trying to force a choice. She thought of the photograph, and the glove left beneath the shutter. Someone she trusted, or at least someone who entered her shop, had been working for Enzo. Who would it be? Sophia demanded. Her hands clenched the rim of the cup. Her voice sharpened. "Who comes here often? Marco, do you have anyone in mind?" Marco's gaze stayed on Isabella. "Not yet. But someone close enough to leave a receipt is dangerous. We can assume innocence." He stood and let his posture make the neighborhood clear. He would sweep the street if he had to. Marco turned and left two men at the door. That night, while the trattoria closed, Isabella locked the shop and felt the old photograph's edges scrape her palm. She thought of customers, an elderly man who read letters aloud, a librarian who brought her lists, a boy who paid in odd coins. She listed names aloud to herself and tested each against the weight of betrayal. The suspicion seeded earlier widened into active searching. She forced herself to call each regular, to check faces against receipts, to notice who had lingered. A grainy video arrived on her phone before dawn. It showed Sophia blindfolded in a dim room, hands bound, a man in a heavy jacket watching her. A caption demanded Isabella come alone to the docks or Sophia would vanish. Isabella looked at the phone screen until the pixels blurred. The fear that had driven her to consider Marco's protection flashed into sharp panic. The stakes were no longer legend. Sophia's life hung in direct threat. Isabella folded the phone and looked at Marco's car in the alley. She could feel the shift inside. Protective resolve toward the shop had to yield to the immediate need to save Sophia. She swallowed and said, "I'll go. I'll meet them. But I go on my terms." Her tone carried negotiation rather than pleading. Marco sat back on his heels, surprised at the edge in her voice. "You will not go alone, Marco. You will not go with more than a small detail." He named the constraints like a tradesman laying out tools. "We watch the docks. We move at dawn. You will keep to the plan." Isabella's fingers brushed the locket again. She unlocked the satchel, removed a wrapped parcel meant for the morning's delivery, and said, "I'll use the delivery as bait. You watch. You don't interfere unless—" She stopped short. She had rehearsed that sentence for nights. It sounded like a promise not to hand herself over. Marco nodded once. The deal was made with a few measured words. The third emotional shift arrived. Panic had focused into practical determination. They met in a narrow rear alley behind the bookshop before first light. Sophia had packed a small bag and hugged Isabella tightly. "Be careful," Sophia then added. "Bring me back." The line was both plea and command. At the docks the rain came down in a sheet. The warehouse smelled of oil and wet wood. Isabella carried the package she always used for the morning delivery. Marco's men were tucked behind crates. Marco himself stood half in shadow, his watch glinting where his sleeve rode back. He steepled his fingers for a moment and then set them to action, moving with slow, exact motion to direct the men. A tall figure waited by the warehouse door, hands in his pockets. He took the parcel and studied the handwriting, the stamp. "He did not open it, Isabella Rossi," he said, as if naming the package changed its weight. His voice dripped through the rain. Isabella felt her jaw set. She handed over a note with the ledger details and watched his fingers close around it. At that instant, men sprang from the shadows. The staged exchange shattered into motion. A gloved hand clamped over Isabella's mouth. A man hauled Sophia from behind a crate, where she had been waiting with two of Enzo's men. Marco roared and ran. His aides hit the deck and moved like muscle memory. Isabella's elbow struck the man's grip, and she twisted free, but another man seized her wrist and dragged her toward a shipping crate. The air filled with the sound of boots and shouted names. Marco cut through the first ring of attackers. He took two men down with a flat, heeled shove and a mailed fist that planted them into a puddle.
"Isabella!"
he barked. His voice had no soft edges. He reached for her and someone slammed into his shoulder. A metal clang echoed as a crate fell over and blocked their line. Isabella felt a thumb press into her side and sensed the texture of wet wood beneath her. She saw Sophia thrown to her knees and then pushed behind a stack of pallets. Isabella tried to move towards Sophia, but a hand caught the back of her coat and tightened. She twisted, tasted grit, and heard Marco curse. He forced his way through a narrow gap, and his fist cracked against a man's jaw. Enzo stepped forward then, appearing where the light hit him like a stage entrance. He lifted his chin and said, "You should have stayed with your books." His voice was contemptuous and carried across the dock. Marco's answer was a punch that missed Enzo but landed on a crate. The confrontation spiraled into a fight that smelled of rain and metal. Isabella felt her knee buckle and then steady. She shoved at a rope that dangled, and it snapped, releasing a coil that thudded into a man's shoulder. A shift occurred. Surprise turned into action. The planned parley had become raw rescue. Sophia gasped and crawled clear when Marco's men slammed into the final attackers. Isabella kept moving, hands sweeping for anything to use. She found a loose bolt and used it to pry a crate open. She tugged a length of frayed rope free and swung it at the nearest man. He stumbled, and for a heartbeat the dock felt like a place she could change with her hands. Her choices were visible and immediate. Enzo snarled and tried to take advantage of the chaos. Marco stepped between him and Isabella. Enough, Marco, voice hard. He reached up and dragged Enzo's coat, forcing him toward the edge of the dock where water hissed against pilings. For a second Enzo looked like a man who might be handed over by force of will. Then a pistol flashed in a pocket and a new threat surfaced. Someone had a gun trained on Marco's aide. Isabella heard Sophia cry out. She turned and ran across slick boards to shove Sophia behind a stack. She shouted, "Sophia, stay down!" Her short sentence landed like a stone. Sophia's breath came sharp and fast. Marco moved with slow, efficient cruelty into the space Enzo had carved and took Enzo's wrist. He used the man's own momentum to slam him into a crate. The dock fight dissolved as sirens sounded faint in the distance. Someone lit a flare, and for a moment the rain looked like fire. Marco hauled Enzo by the collar and held him so that men could put cuffs on two of the attackers. Enzo spat, already calculating a next move. Marco looked at Isabella, rain on his brow, and said, "You saved Sophia. That choice matters." His voice was flat. Isabella sank to a crate and let the rain run down her neck. Her hands shook. She had moved from stubborn independence to bargaining to direct action. The emotional arc had wound through fear, resolve, panic, and a hard-earned clarity. She had chosen movement over hiding. She had chosen to test the betrayal with her feet instead of her silence. On the rooftop that dawn, Isabella sat with the metal cold beneath her palms and the locket open on her knee. The city behind her warmed slowly as fog lifted from the river. Marco sat a step away, watching the street below. He spoke plainly. "If we continue, there will be costs. Allies will be asked to do things you want to like. People will be watched. I want to ask you to surrender your life. I will ask you to share the risk." Isabella turned the locket between her fingers and found the faint smudge of cologne again. She thought of the receipts and the photograph left at her shop. She felt something like resolve settle into a practical plan. "Then tell me what you need from me," she said. Her voice had the same quiet firmness as before, but now carried the weight of someone who had acted. Marco hesitated and then said, "We will name watchers. We will reroute deliveries. We will test the regulars. You will not be alone on the dock again." He steepled his fingers, a small motion that matched the slow, controlled man she had watched earlier. Isabella met his eyes and saw the cost reflected in the lines around them. A phone buzzed in his coat. Marco read the message and tightened his jaw. "Enzo wants a meeting. He sent a location. He says it's over. He never says that for nothing." He rose and reached down to offer her a hand. Isabella stood and tucked the locket back under her shirt. She felt the weight of choices press into her shoulders in the way a satchel did. Familiar and undeniable, she took Marco's hand and stepped toward the stair. As they reached the rooftop doorway, a car horn sounded from below and a plain envelope slid under the door. Isabella saw the flap. Her fingers closed around it. She opened it with steady hands and found a single line. "Meet me where you keep your books." The note had no signature. Isabella folded the paper into her palm. Her breath was steady now. She looked at Marco and said, "Then we go." Together the sentence was small and concrete. Marco nodded once. They moved down the stairs together, and the chapter ended with the two of them stepping into the alley light where the envelope had been placed. The decision clear and the next demand already on the table. Masked hands closed on Isabella's wrist as the rooftop tiles cut into her palm. Fear tightened her throat and moved her feet before thought could. She pulled the antique locket closer, feeling the cold of the metal through the fabric of her coat. A van's engine kicked below. Someone hissed, quick down the stairs. That command made the central problem plain within seconds. Enzo's men would not stop until they dragged her back into the life she had refused. Isabella's pulse thudded against her collarbone, and she acted on one clear rule: do not let them take the locket. She had kept calm for weeks by small, precise routines. Opening the bookshop at 9, lining the shelves, ringing the bell for Sophia when she arrived. Now those routines collapsed into motion. Isabella twisted free and shoved a rooftop drain pipe to gain a step. She shoved the locket into her coat pocket with the left hand and used the right to hook a cracked terra-cotta tile. Her fingers smelled of lemon oil and dust from the books below. Fear pushed her down the stairs. Determination pushed her toward the alley where Marco's car might find them. 2 masked men hauled at her arm. One brought his face close enough that she could see the dry edge of breath fogging in the pre-dawn chill. "Keep her quiet," he said. Isabella jerked her head, then kicked outward at a knee. The man grunted. A second man swung a flashlight, and the beam cut across her cheek, catching the delicate scar above her left eyebrow. The scar stung, a physical memory from a childhood fall. She used that small H to steady her jaw. She did not scream. Below, a black van swerved between lamplights and the city hummed awake. This neighborhood had known threats before: the sealed envelope at midnight, the photograph shoved through the mail slot, the Trattoria's lamp shattered by a shot. Isabella remembered the photograph, stamp corner, and the thumbprint. She had pressed her palm against it as if she could read its message by touch. Those incidents had not been idle warnings. Now the rooftop confirmed the pattern. Enzo wanted to drag her out of peaceful routines and into open conflict. A booted foot knocked at a loose tile beneath her. She lost purchase, slid, and the edge of the roof bit into her palm. Metal clattered. The man holding her hissed and tightened his grip. Isabella whirled and elbowed him hard enough to make him stagger back. She kept moving, feet finding the narrow fire escape. An alley yawned below where cobbles glistened with last night's rain. She did not look up for help. She could not assume it would come. When Marco's phone vibrated in a heavy coat pocket 2 blocks away, he answered with a single syllable. Now, his driver blinked. Marco steepled his fingers for a second, then barked, hit the alley to the left. Cut them off at Gennaro's. The sound of tires on wet cobbles rose in a controlled chorus. Marco's voice carried the order outward. It did not carry reassurance for Isabella yet. Inside his control, worry lived like a measured instrument. He had seen the photograph. He had watched the shot punch the Trattoria lamp. Each piece fit together in a map that led toward this rooftop. Sophia slammed her palm against the closed iron shutter of the bookshop and listened for footsteps. Her expectation was that Isabella would be late by a minute or 2, not absent altogether. She pressed her ear to the metal and caught nothing but distant engines. The street smelled of espresso and frying oil from the corner cafe. Sophia's hands trembled for a fraction of a second, then she smoothed her apron and stepped back into the doorway. She moved to the back, opening the storage door with a key that rattled like a small bell. She could not yet know whom she would meet in the dark. The chase spilled into the alleys with a scrape and a shout. Marco's driver kept the sedan 2 car lengths behind the van, engines coughing. Marco stood between driver and door, the long overcoat flaring as he swung out. He watched a van's brake lights flicker, then cut a wheel to block an escape route. Marco, his men, right flank. No gun unless I say. He used names, short commands. That reduced chaos. He had not come to the alleys for a hostage negotiation. He came for one person and the thing she carried in a tiny gold locket. Isabella felt the van bump potholes and slide over cobbles. Her hands burned where ropes had scraped. They shoved her into the back where the smell of rubber and fabric glue clung heavy. One man laughed and said, "You picked the wrong night, princess." Isabella kept her jaw loose. She focused on the locket's outline through her clothing. She fingered the chain until the man nearest her shifted to keep watch. Her fingers found the locket hinge and she pressed it, finding that it did not open. Someone had welded it closed in panic or protection. She did not know which. Outside, Marco's car cut the corner at a shallow angle and his men fanned out. He moved without spectacle, calling out to men by name. Rosa, block the north road. Paulo with me, the names attached responsibility. They also anchored action in a way that made things happen. He watched the van pull into a narrow passage between two workshops. From his vantage, he saw a sliver of the van's rear and a man leaned to check a bolt. Marco slid from behind a parked delivery truck and pushed forward past crates stacked with empty wine cases. Sophia encountered a second man at the bookshop shutter. He smelled of expensive cologne and ash. He leaned on the sill as if making casual conversation, though his eyes searched the dark. "Isabella's not here, Sophia." Her voice did not wobble. The man tapped his cuff. "You sure?" he asked. He expected bluffing to fail. Sophia set down the tray she was carrying and said, "If Isabella needed help, she would knock. You can ask again, Mr. Lucari." She used his name. That small provocation made him laugh and step back. Sophia's bluff bought time. She had learned in other nights that a tea urn and a steady face could slow a man who wanted answers. Inside the van, Isabella watched a seam of morning light fracture along the van's wooden slats. She remembered the trattoria, the vendor's crate, the tomatoes, and a man who had aimed for the lamp as if to send a message. Those concrete images hardened into a choice. If she revealed what she carried, she risked everything. If she kept quiet, she might be bargaining pawn. Isabella felt fear bend into another feeling, a controlled resolve to use the locket for what it might be. She tested the seam again, and this time a faint give answered beneath her nail. The hinge loosened with a quiet click. She inhaled a stuttering breath and forced herself to listen for external sounds. An alleyway collision happened when Marco's men forced the van's rear doors open. The sudden light struck their faces raw. A man shoved toward Isabella, and she swung her elbow into his ribs while she scooted back. The other kidnapper lunged to grab her. Marco stepped into the van with two men, and his presence filled the cramped space. He reached for Isabella, and she looked up at him with the locket cupped in both hands. "Isabella, Marco." He did not smile. He took one motion to check the ropes, the other to steady her shoulders. "Keep it closed until we talk," he instructed. His voice held no theatrical gentleness. It held a practical claim. Isabella's breath came out in small, measured pulls. She answered with a single, sharp nod. They moved to an abandoned warehouse courtyard, where dawn stripped color from brick. Marco's men unbound her with practiced hands and set the kidnappers on their knees against a stack of pallets. The men looked stunned and exhausted. One kept whispering, "We were told to make it look clean." He meant not to scar, to take her quietly. Marco's jaw tightened. He pressed his thumb and forefinger together and then released. He did not ask why yet. His priority was safety and answers. Isabella opened the locket in the courtyard with fingers that still trembled. Inside, folded and pressed between two halves of the locket, was a thin ledger page no bigger than a postage stamp. A thin line of ink ran across the page, names, dates, and amounts. The handwriting was small and deliberate. One name made her eyes narrow, Lucari. Another column showed transfers that did not fit public records. The ledger proved an inside betrayal. Isabella's hands showed the ledger to Marco with a single motion. Enzo kept a ledger. Isabella, voice low but steady, he recorded payments that Don T belonged to him. He took money from our partners and hid it under his name. She the facts. Marco's steepled fingers flexed. "This is leverage," he said. He raised his head and looked at the kneeling men. "Call Sophia. Tell her to secure the shop and hold the neighborhood line." No surprises, he folded the ledger and slid it into his inner pocket. The ledger changed the tenor of the moment from rescue to negotiation. It turned a physical retrieval into a political move. Sophia's bluff at the shutter had turned into a physical confrontation when Enzo's lieutenant returned with a car and a few more men. The lieutenant's impatience flared into violence when Sophia refused to open the shutter. He shoved the shutter and her hand caught the edge. Pain flared across her knuckles. Still she refused. She looked him in the eye and said, "You will not take Isabella through my door." He smiled too easily and said, "We are not taking her through your door. We are taking answers." Sophia pulled a small brass whistle from an apron pocket and blew. The sharp sound cut across the morning. Two neighbors looked down from their windows. Footsteps approached. The lieutenant cursed and moved off. Sophia had bought another sliver of time. Marco assembled a simple plan in the warehouse courtyard. He would meet Enzo at the dockside warehouse for a parley. He would bring the ledger as both shield and bait. "Marco, we set terms, you bring men. You leave blood off the floor, or you lose the ledger and the names inside." Isabella heard the word terms and felt a new wave of something, unease that bent toward anger. She wanted no part of trading lives like cards. I want to be a bargaining chip, Marco. Her voice held more command than it had 2 hours earlier on the rooftop. Marco's eyes sharpened. "Isabella, I want to let you get used as a lever. But this ledger will stop more violence if we use it properly." He spoke quickly, the words short. "Sophia will hold the shop. I'll take the ledger to the dock. If Enzo moves, we expose him. If he stays, we talk." Isabella weighed the decision in the set of her jaw. She felt fear shift to a steady insistence on control. She placed her palm on the ledger in his pocket and said, "Promise me I keep choice after this." Marco's thumb brushed her hand once, a small, controlled motion. "You do," he said. Enzo arrived at the dockside warehouse with a small motorcade and a broad, theatrical grin. He stepped from a midnight blue sedan wearing a jacket that flashed gold at the cuffs. He clapped his hands once. "Marco," he said, loud enough for the men to hear, "bring Isabella forward. Let's make this quick." He sauntered as a man who preferred spectacle. Marco met him under the amber lights and the two men measured each other's stations with quiet motions. Men shifted, knives glinted, and the warehouse smelled of oil and old rope. The ledger sat between them like a new device in a well-known machine. The meeting opened with formal words that meant little, and with eyes that meant everything. Enzo started with venom soon into a courteous phrase. "You come with accusations, Santoro. You bring rumors dressed as facts." Marco answered bluntly. "You framed allies and hid payments." "We have evidence." Enzo laughed. "Then show me the evidence." He had his men fan forward. Isabella stepped from behind Marco. She kept the locket buttoned against her chest. She had decided that silence would no longer be hers to give. She walked forward and said, "Open the ledger if you want pity. Read it yourself." Her voice was short and precise. She added, "Enzo." She had looked right at him. The argument escalated within minutes. Voices rose and fists tightened. The warehouse lights bounced off cheap metal and pooled in corners. Enzo's men pushed forward. Marco answered with a hand signal and a heavy exhale. "Get back," Marco ordered. The warehouse filled with quick trading lines. "Enzo, you think you can humiliate me in my own docks?" Marco. "I think you are finished stealing while claiming honor." Enzo. "You can just..." Marco. "Watch me." The exchange hung like pulled wire. Then the first blow landed. A fight broke open with quick, controlled violence. Marco moved with an economy of motion that found Enzo's nearest man and pinned his arm behind his back. Enzo lunged at Marco and the two men collided mid-sentence. Sounds of impact thudded loud in the warehouse. Isabella stepped forward between them and put her hand on Marco's chest. "Stop," she said. The word cut clean. "Not here." Her voice did not appeal to reason. It issued a physical boundary. Enzo spat. "You will not stop me, princess." He meant to cut her down with insult. Sophia, who had followed in the periphery after securing the shop, pushed through a side door and stood beside Isabella. Sophia's presence changed the rhythm. She shoved a small recorder onto a crate and said, "Listen to this, Enzo. The men you paid 1T back you if we play this on air. People hear money being stolen. They move away from you." Sophia's tone was practical and cold. Enzo's face tightened. He barked a laugh and said, "You think your little civic tricks scare me?" Sophia answered with facts, short and sharp. "We have witnesses. We have invoices. We have men ready to testify." The lieutenants around Enzo shifted uneasily. A quick back and forth followed between Marco and Enzo with 6 rapid exchanges of accusations and promises. Marco named places and dates. Enzo named debts and threats. Their voices cut into one another, and each sentence shortened the distance toward resolution or violence. At one point Enzo ordered a man to drag Isabella forward, and the man hesitated. There were eyes watching him. The hesitation made Enzo shout, and the shout made someone strike with a wrench. The wrench struck metal. The echo threw dust into shafts of light, and a man crumpled. For a breath, the warehouse filled with sound and not much else. Then Marco moved, a single controlled sequence that disarmed a man with a knife, shoved another against a piling, and forced Enzo back with a lock of the wrist. The fight ended as quickly as it started but left a shape. Enzo on the ground, breathing hard, his shoulder scraping concrete. He had misjudged the ledger's immediate weight. Enzo's face turned from color to pale. He spat a bloodline and then laughed once, a short, humorless sound. He made a choice. "You win this floor, Santoro," he said, "but the docks are not the only place I own." He gestured and men around him stood, retreating with him as he slid into his motorcade. Marco watched them go. The ledger remained folded in his pocket. For a moment the men in the warehouse stood in the hush that follows violence, and then someone clapped slowly. Marco did not laugh. The aftermath moved quickly into negotiations. Marco demanded a public renunciation of Enzo's ledger and quiet compensation to those whose names were listed. He framed the terms in hard gestures. 1 written pledge, 2 neutral mediators, and Enzo's promise to clear people he had targeted. Enzo signed with a shaky hand, his cufflinks flashing like small suns. Sophia coached Isabella on what to ask next. The bookshop woman who had once brewed espresso now read legal phrasing aloud with authority. When the formal paper lay between them, "Marco, you keep your freedom. Isabella, you can choose your life. You decide how public you make this ledger." Isabella picked up a pen. Her hand did not shake. She signed the margin with a short stroke and a small cross. "I will not live under threat to make your deals easier," she said. The sentence was both refusal and agreement. Marco folded the paper and handed it to Sophia for safekeeping. She put it in an envelope stamped with their initials. Sophia walked back toward the bookshop with the envelope tucked under her arm. She had left a neighbor on the corner to watch the street and to call if any motorcade returned. The morning sun rose a notch and painted the bakery window across the way in pale gold. She turned the key and opened the shutter. The bell trilled the same single note as always. Sophia set a pot of espresso on the stove and listened for the sound of a door she knew by habit. Isabella stayed on the dockside platform long enough to watch Enzo's cars diminish. She took a slow breath and felt a change. Fear had pushed her into motion. Then determination had clarified what she would fight for. Now a guarded relief settled into her shoulders. She had lost nothing of her insistence on independence. She had gained leverage that might keep others safe. Marco stood beside her, a small, contained figure under the warehouse light. He touched the outer seam of the locket at his lapel, and then brought his hand away. "You did the right thing bringing that ledger to light, Marco." He kept his words to the point. He did not promise anything beyond the present. Isabella folded her fingers around the locket that now sat in her palm again. "I keep my choices," she said. That was the condition. Marco inclined his head once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than making a vow. They returned to the neighborhood in the softer noon light. Sophia was waiting outside the bookshop with a thermos and a small paper cup balanced on a saucer. "You took your time, Sophia," half laughter and half accusation. "We kept a whole line of regulars entertained." Isabella managed a thin smile as she accepted the cup. The taste of espresso felt ordinary and grounding. It connected back to the small rituals that had once been her whole life. A surprised twist appeared when Marco opened the ledger in private and found a second folded page tucked behind the list of payments. A receipt from an old Rossi trustee specifying a transfer dated years earlier that implicated a trusted accountant. The paper made Isabella remember the sealed envelope placed in her hand in Chapter 1 and the damp thumbprint on the photograph. The ledger's second page explained motives behind earlier acts. It turned some earlier assumptions into clearer direction. That revelation changed how Isabella viewed those who had quietly supported her and those who had not. Isabella Marco to bring the accountant in for questions. Marco arranged it. The accountant came in a thin grey suit and sat with his hands flat on a table while Marco spoke. The conversation that followed included 5 short, precise questions and honest answers about funds diverted years ago. The accountant's face held a tired resignation. He confessed to passing along ledgers because of fear and now wanted to set them right. The confession was a small, concrete action that closed a loop stretching back to the photograph and the sealed envelope. The neighborhood adjusted. People who had watched the shouting from windows returned to their routines with small nods when they met Isabella in the street. The bell above the bookshop door took on a new sound for her. It no longer simply announced customers. It marked her deliberate choice to open and to let the neighborhood see her. She kept the locket in a small velvet pouch inside her satchel rather than wearing it on a chain. She had decided that the object would remain private. The final scene took place back on a rooftop several days later at dawn, where air felt thin and the city unfolded in neat blocks below. Isabella climbed alone with the locket in a palm. She stood on the low parapet and looked at the skyline, brick, terraced roofs, laundry lines, a metal TV antenna blinking against the pale sky. She did not rehearse an inner speech. She breathed, tightened the strap of her satchel, and moved to sit on a low stone bench. Sophia arrived with a paper bag of pastries and a thermos. She sat down beside Isabella and handed her a croissant. "You look like you slept in 7 places last night." Sophia, the remark sharp with a smile. Isabella laughed briefly and said, "I haven't slept enough." Sophia's face softened. "Then take this morning slow. Put the locket away for now." Isabella unwrapped the velvet pouch and pressed the locket to her sternum once, like the small ritual she had used to steady herself on the van. Then she closed the pouch and slipped it into the satchel. Marco came up the service stair and stood behind them without intruding. He looked out at the district with hands folded. He nothing at first. Then he asked, "Are you sure?" He meant the ledger, the negotiation, the terms. Isabella turned and said, "Yes, I will keep the shop. I will not be used, but I will not pretend it's all gone. I will keep the ledger's copy where it can do good." Her voice kept the decision precise. Marco nodded once. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees, a small, contained gesture. "I will keep my promise." "You have my word to stop them from taking what you choose to keep." Isabella met his gaze. She did not ask for more. She did not give more. Sophia watched the exchange and then reached out to squeeze Isabella's shoulder. A final, small external event closed the chapter. The bell of Isabella's shop below chimed as someone opened the door and a new customer stepped in. The sound arrived crisp through the morning air. Isabella slid the key into her satchel, rose, and tied her coat tighter. She stood and looked out over the rooftops one last time. Then she folded the satchel over her shoulder and walked back toward the stairs with Sophia and Marco following for a few steps, the 3 of them leaving the rooftop behind. The bookshop door clicked softly as Isabella turned the lock and stepped inside.